The Vreth Collective had never lost a mission. Not once in 400 years of expansion had their warrior-class soldiers, the Vreth Blades, failed to complete an assignment. They had brought down governments on 6 different worlds. They had ended wars before those wars even had a chance to begin. They had walked into places where armies waited and walked back out without a scratch. The Collective's council did not see them as soldiers. They saw them as tools, sharp, reliable, and always effective. So when the council decided that Earth needed to be handled, they did not send a fleet. They did not send diplomats. They sent 12 Vreth Blades in a single insertion pod, and they considered the matter mostly settled before it even began. The galactic community watched with mild interest. Earth was a young civilization, barely a century into space travel, with no allies and no real standing in any galactic council. Most species considered humanity noisy, unpredictable, and not particularly dangerous. A few of the older civilizations had flagged certain historical patterns in human behavior as worth monitoring, but those warnings were politely noted and quietly ignored. The Collective's council reviewed the same reports and saw a primitive planet with impressive weapons but no experience fighting anything truly advanced. The Blades would eliminate key figures in Earth's defense command, leave a message carved into whatever structure they chose, and return home within 2 weeks. The insertion pod burned through Earth's atmosphere on a Tuesday night, moving too fast and too quiet for most tracking systems to catch. It came down hard in a stretch of thick forest in northern Canada, far from any city, far from any road. The impact left a shallow crater and a ring of scorched trees. No explosion. No fire. The pod was designed to hit and disappear, and it did exactly that. By Wednesday morning, 3 different satellite systems had flagged an anomalous heat signature in that region. 2 of them were civilian weather arrays and dismissed the reading as a sensor error. The third belonged to Earth's Global Defense Division, and it landed on the desk of Commander Dale Harmon before he had finished his first cup of coffee. Dale was not a man who moved quickly in the mornings, but he moved quickly then. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had spent too many years in too many difficult places. He had served in 3 different conflict zones before moving into command work, and he had learned early in his career that the readings nobody could explain were almost always the readings that mattered. He pulled the satellite data, cross-referenced it with 2 other systems that had caught something faint at the edges of their range, and spent about 4 minutes thinking before he picked up the phone. He did not call the full council. He called Field Officer Carla Voss. Carla was 38, quiet by nature, precise in the way she spoke and the way she moved. She had spent years working in remote reconnaissance and had a talent for moving through difficult terrain without leaving much evidence that she had been there at all. Dale trusted her more than he trusted most people with twice her experience. He told her to take a small team, go quiet, and find out what came down in that forest. She asked no unnecessary questions. She picked 4 people, packed light, and was on a transport within the hour. The team reached the area by late afternoon. The forest was dense and dark even with daylight still coming through the trees. Carla moved them in slowly, checking the ground ahead before each step, keeping spacing between team members, staying off any obvious path. They found the crater before they found anything else, a shallow bowl in the earth about 8 meters across, with the soil at the center fused into something almost glassy from the heat. The ring of burned trees around it still smelled like smoke. Whatever had come down had done so with enormous speed and not much size. She took photographs, collected samples from the fused soil, and marked the coordinates. Then she spread the team out in a wide perimeter and told them to look for anything that did not belong. They found tracks. Not human tracks. The impressions were too deep for the weight they suggested, and the spacing was wrong, too wide, too even, like something built for efficiency rather than comfort. There were 12 separate sets of them leading away from the crater in different directions, some heading north, some heading east, a few moving toward the tree line to the west. Carla crouched over the clearest set and studied them for a long moment without saying anything. She photographed everything and reported back to Dale that evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then told her to hold position overnight and keep the team together. He would have analysis back to her before morning. The analysis did not tell him much he did not already suspect. The tracks did not match any known animal. The pod material that Carla had photographed from a distance was not from any human manufacturer or any design currently in Earth's possession. Someone had come down from above, and whoever they were, they had split up immediately after landing and moved outward with clear purpose. Dale sat in his office for a long time that night, looking at the photographs. He had read the intelligence reports about the Vreth Collective. Everyone in his position had. The collective was large, old, and had a history of absorbing smaller civilizations through a combination of pressure and precision. They did not usually bother with outright war. They preferred to make the target feel helpless before any formal demand was made. Take out the right people. Destroy the right systems. Let the fear do most of the work. By the time they made their offer, most civilizations were grateful just to be given terms at all. He understood what 12 sets of tracks leading away from a single pod meant. What he did not do was panic. He drafted a short report for the council, marked it at the highest classification level, and recommended that no public statement be made and no emergency session be called. He asked for quiet authority to activate a monitoring protocol and begin internal assessments of Defense Command vulnerabilities. The council, most of whom trusted Dale's judgment more than their own instincts in situations like this, approved the request within 2 hours. Then he went back to the satellite feeds and started watching. By Thursday morning, Carla's team was 1 member short. Specialist Owen Garrett had been on perimeter watch at the north edge of the team's position. He had checked in at 2 in the morning, then again at 3. At 4, his radio went silent. Carla swept the perimeter herself at first light and found nothing, no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks that did not belong there. Just the place where Owen had been standing, and a stillness in the trees around it that felt heavier than it should have. She reported it to Dale with a steady voice. He listened and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly. More like the specific feeling of a situation confirming the worst version of itself. He told Carla to pull the team back to a safe distance and hold. Then he sat down at his desk, thought carefully for several minutes, and reached for a file he had kept locked in a separate system for almost 2 years, a file he had hoped he would never need to open. The file was labeled Pale Return. He opened it. Outside, the world went on as normal. People went to work, ate breakfast, argued about small things, and had no idea that something had come down from the sky in a quiet forest and taken one of Dale's people without leaving a single trace behind. That was exactly what the Vreth Blades wanted. They had done this before, on 6 different worlds, and it had always worked the same way. First the silence. Then the fear. Then the collapse. They did not yet know that on those other 6 worlds, the people who vanished never came back to do anything about it. On Earth, the man looking at the file called Pale Return was already thinking about what came next. The attacks came fast after that. Not loud and obvious the way most people imagined an alien assault would look. There were no ships in the sky, no explosions lighting up city centers, no dramatic announcements. The Vreth Blades worked the way a blade is supposed to work, clean, precise, and quiet. A senior communications officer at a Pacific Defense relay station was found unconscious at his post with no memory of the previous 4 hours and every encrypted access code in his system wiped clean. A radar installation in northern Norway simply stopped sending signals one morning, and when a repair crew reached it 2 days later, the equipment was intact but everything inside had been methodically destroyed. 3 members of Earth's Joint Defense Advisory Board canceled all their meetings in the same week, each citing personal emergencies that, when checked, had no record of existing. People were scared. Not the public did not know yet, but the people inside the defense networks who were watching the pattern emerge were scared in the specific way that trained professionals get scared, which is quietly and without showing it, while their hands move faster and their voices get very careful. Most of the Joint Council wanted to open a communication channel with the Vreth Collective. The argument was simple. They were dealing with something they did not understand, something that was clearly operating at a level beyond current human capability, and reaching out was the rational choice. Several of the council members had already drafted language for a formal contact request. One of them used the word negotiation 4 times in a single paragraph. Dale Harmon sat through the meeting without saying much. He let them talk. He waited until the draft language was on the table and everyone was looking at him for a response, and then he said, simply and without any particular heat in his voice, that he would not be sending that message. The room went quiet. He told them the Vreth Collective had not come to negotiate. He told them the pattern they were seeing was not an opening move toward a conversation, it was a softening operation, the same kind that the collective had run on 5 other civilizations before making demands that left those civilizations with no real choice. He put a single page of intelligence summary on the table and let them read it. Then he told them he had something he wanted to activate, and he needed their authorization to do it. They argued for another hour. In the end, they gave him what he asked for. Pale return had existed as a classified concept for almost 3 years. Dale had developed it after studying a pattern he kept finding in Earth's own history, the way that, in every major conflict humanity had ever faced, the most effective responses had not come from the largest armies or the most advanced weapons. They had come from small groups of people who were very good at moving through difficult environments, finding enemies that did not want to be found, and doing things quietly that changed the shape of an entire conflict. He had spent a long time thinking about what that meant for a threat that was itself small, quiet, and precision-based. Pale Return was not a conventional military program. It had no uniforms, no rank structure that anyone outside the program would recognize, and no entry in any budget document under that name. The people assigned to it were drawn from records that most military administrators did not even have clearance to access: survival specialists, trackers, people who had spent years in wilderness environments doing things that required patience, silence, and a very specific kind of focused calm. Some of them had military backgrounds. Some did not. All of them had one thing in common: they had been in situations where most people would have broken, and they had not broken. Cole Briggs was the first name on the list Dale pulled up. Cole was 46, originally from a small town in Montana, and had spent the better part of 2 decades doing work that involved going into places where other people could not operate and staying there until the job was done. He had a quiet face and a slow way of speaking that made people underestimate him until they had reason not to. He showed up at the Pale Return facility in northern Washington state 2 days after Dale made the call, carrying one bag and asking no questions about the bigger picture. He only wanted to know the shape of the target. The second name was Nina Ford. Nina was 34, from rural Georgia, and had a background in wildlife tracking and search and rescue that had taken her into some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. She could read a forest the way most people read a page of text, quickly, quietly, and without missing the details that changed the meaning of everything else. She arrived the same day as Cole and spent the first evening studying every piece of information Dale's team had collected about the Vreth blades, reading it twice through, then asking 3 very specific questions that told Dale she had already understood more than most of his analysts. Over the next 10 days, the rest of the Pale Return roster came together. 12 people in total. No ceremony, no speeches. Dale briefed them once, gave them everything he had, and told them the only objective was to locate, track, and counter the blade units before the collective had time to complete enough of their softening operation to move to the next phase. He told them he did not expect them to fight the blades directly in open engagement. He told them he expected them to be worse than the blades at their own game. Cole looked at the photographs from the Canadian forest for a long time and then said that the spacing on the tracks suggested the blades thought in a straight line, efficient movement, minimum deviation, destination focused. He said that was actually a weakness. Nina agreed without looking up from the report she was reading. The team moved out in pairs, spread across 3 continents, following the trail of disrupted systems and silent installations that the blades had left behind. They moved slowly. They did not rush. They watched and listened and built a picture of how the blades operated, when they moved, how they selected targets, what patterns they repeated without seeming to realize they were repeating them. Within 6 days, something shifted. The blades had been moving through human territory with complete confidence, the way a predator moves through space it believes belongs to it. But confidence is a posture, and posture changes when something at the edge of awareness begins to feel wrong. One of the blade units in the Norwegian woodland paused for the first time and doubled back along its own trail. Another unit in the American Southwest changed direction twice in a single night without any apparent tactical reason. A third unit stopped transmitting its location signals to the others, not because it had been compromised, but because it was being cautious. They were feeling something they had not expected to feel. Nina Ford, crouched in the dark under the tree line at the edge of a ridge in Colorado with frozen ground under her and stars above her, noticed the change in the blade unit she had been following. She watched it pause and scan the darkness around it. She stayed completely still and let it look. It did not see her. It would not. She had learned a long time ago that what made a tracker dangerous was not speed or strength. It was the ability to exist in a space without announcing that existence. She clicked her radio twice to signal Cole that the unit had gone defensive. Cole, 800 miles north, clicked back once. They both understood what it meant. The Vreth blades had come to Earth to hunt. They were accustomed to choosing when and where and how. That was the only way they had ever operated, across every world they had ever touched. They did not yet understand that on this world, the moment they landed and split up and moved into the dark, they had stopped being the hunters. They had become the practice. The collective's command station in orbit above Earth was not large. It was a relay point, mostly automated, with a crew of 6 and 1 intelligence officer assigned to monitor the blade operation and report back to the Council. The officer's name was Grathvel, and he had been doing this kind of work for 19 years across 9 different planetary assessments. He was considered precise, calm, and reliable. He had never filed an emergency report before. He filed one on the 16th day of the operation. It was not because of what the blades had done. It was because of what they had stopped doing. Grathvel had been tracking the blade units through their locator signals and the periodic updates they transmitted back to the station. In the first week, those updates were confident and consistent: targets identified, systems compromised, movement efficient, local defense showing no meaningful response. Standard pattern for a softening operation. Everything proceeding as the Council had projected. He had been writing his routine summaries and thinking about the meal he would eat when his rotation ended. Then the signals started changing. Not the content of the reports. The rhythm of them. Blade units that had been moving with straight-line efficiency started taking longer to cover shorter distances. Check-ins that had come every 6 hours started coming every 4, then every 3. One unit stopped moving entirely for 11 hours and gave no reason in its report. Another changed its route 3 times in a single night, which should not have been necessary given the terrain it was crossing. Grathvel pulled up the movement maps and stared at them for a long time. The blades were not being attacked. There was no record of any direct engagement. But their behavior had changed, and behavior changed for a reason. He started digging into the human intelligence files he had been given before the operation began. Most of what he found was what he expected: military structures, weapons systems, communication networks, political hierarchies. The collective had assessed all of it before sending the blades, and the assessment had been reasonable. Humanity had weapons, but no experience fighting anything at the blades level. They had armies, but armies were not designed to counter a precision insertion unit. The assessment had rated the probability of meaningful human resistance as very low. What the assessment had not covered in any real depth was history. Grathvel was thorough by nature, and the change in the blade reports made him go looking for things the original assessment had skipped over. He pulled historical records going back several hundred years and started reading. He read about human conflicts that had gone on for years in dense terrain, fought not by large armies but by small groups of people who knew the ground and used that knowledge in ways that made large armies ineffective. He read about practices that had no equivalent in any species the collective had catalogued: the deliberate study of how to move without being seen, how to track a target across any kind of environment, how to wait in one place for days or weeks without breaking patience. He read about a concept that humans called ambush warfare, and another they called asymmetric conflict, and the more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. What disturbed him most was not the tactics themselves. Other species used similar methods in limited ways. What disturbed him was the depth of it, the sheer amount of time humanity had spent developing, refining, and teaching these skills, not as a response to any outside threat, but because humans had spent centuries hunting each other. They had done it on every continent, in every kind of terrain, across every kind of political and social arrangement. Generation after generation had passed this knowledge forward, adding to it, improving it, making it more effective. The collective's database had nothing comparable. No other spacefaring species had ever had cause to develop this kind of knowledge base because no other spacefaring species had spent its formative centuries in constant, detailed, creative conflict with itself. Grathvel sat back in his chair and thought about 12 Vreth blades moving through forests and mountains and plains on a planet full of people who had been practicing this exact kind of conflict for longer than the collective had been keeping records. Then he wrote his emergency report and sent it without waiting for the routine transmission window. Down on the surface, Cole Briggs had not slept in 31 hours, and he did not look like it bothered him much. He was lying in a shallow depression under a covering of brush and loose branches at the edge of a frozen lake in northern Minnesota, watching the far tree line through a scope. The blade unit he had been tracking for 4 days had settled into a pattern. It moved at night, rested in dense cover during the day, and chose positions with good sight lines in multiple directions. It was a disciplined unit. Professional. Cole had spent the better part of a week learning exactly how it thought. He knew what it would do next. He had already been where it was going. The blade unit moved out of the tree line just before midnight, crossing the frozen lake surface in a straight line toward the far shore where a relay installation sat dark and quiet. Cole watched it move and counted its steps and noted the spacing between the 3 individuals that made up the unit. He had seen this pattern before. They always sent 2 ahead and kept 1 back as a watch position. The watch position always chose the highest ground available within 30 meters. He knew where that ground was. He had put something there 2 days ago. He did not engage the unit directly. That was not the objective. When the unit reached the far shore and found the installation already empty of anything useful, everything had been quietly removed and relocated 48 hours earlier, and when the watch position settled into the spot Cole had anticipated, it found a single object waiting there. A small metal case, sealed, with a marking on the outside that the blade would recognize as a collective intelligence format. Inside the case was a short message written in the collective's own encoding, which the Pale Return team had spent considerable time reverse engineering from the signals they had intercepted. The message said only this: "We know you are here, we know how many of you there are, we know where you are going, and we are going to let one of you go home to explain what happened to the rest." Cole clicked his radio twice and moved away from the lake before the unit had time to process what it had found. Nina Ford was in the mountains of northern Montana that same night, and she was not watching. She was moving. She had spent 3 days positioning herself behind a blade unit that had been operating with the confidence of something that did not expect to be followed, and now she was close enough to hear the sounds it made when it moved through the underbrush. It did not move quietly enough. She had noticed that about all the blade units, they were efficient, not subtle. There was a difference. She had the unit's senior member in sight for a clean approach window for almost 20 minutes before she closed the distance and took him. There was a short, intense struggle. The blade soldier was fast and strong and highly trained, and Nina came away from it with bruised ribs and a cut on her forearm. The blade soldier came away from it unconscious and zip-tied with industrial restraints in a transport case she had staged 200 meters back in the tree line. She called it in to Dale with her usual steady voice. Dale told her good work, and asked if she was all right. She said she had worse bruises from training and asked what he wanted done with the prisoner. Dale thought for exactly 3 seconds and told her to send him home. Not to a human facility. Home, to the collective, with Cole's message folded into his front pocket and a small recorder in his gear that would transmit a live signal for exactly 1 hour after he was recovered. He wanted the collective to hear what their soldier said when he woke up and was asked what had happened to him. Whatever the Vreth blades had expected to find on Earth, this was not it. And the collective, listening to that transmission from their command station in orbit, would begin to understand something that their assessment had missed entirely. They had not sent hunters to a defenseless world. They had sent hunters into the oldest hunting ground in the known galaxy. The Vreth Council met in closed session for 6 hours after the recovered blade soldier's transmission was reviewed. The soldier's report was not long. He had been operational for 14 days without any indication of serious threat. Then something had tracked him across mountain terrain for 72 hours without him detecting it, closed and during a narrow window he had considered secure, and put him down in under 40 seconds. He had been transported, restrained, and released back to collective space as deliberately as someone returning a borrowed item. The message in his pocket had been read aloud in the council chamber twice. The faction that had pushed for the Earth operation argued that this was a single failure from a single unit, statistically meaningful but not conclusive. The blades were still operational on the surface. The softening campaign was still running. The answer was not retreat, it was escalation. The moderates on the council argued for a pause, a reassessment. The intelligence graph Vel had filed was sitting on every council member's desk, and most of them had read it at least twice. The historical data on human conflict patterns was uncomfortable reading for anyone who had assumed the mission would be straightforward. The escalation faction won the argument. 3 weeks after the first insertion pod had come down in northern Canada, a second deployment left collective space, not a pod this time, but a full insertion carrier, carrying 36 blade soldiers in 3 units of 12, with heavier equipment, dedicated communication arrays, and orbital support that would allow direct fire assistance if the units on the ground requested it. The Council sent a short message to Grathvel. The operation was expanding, his role was to observe and report, and Earth was to be treated as a higher priority target than originally assessed. Grathvel acknowledged the order. He did not express any opinion in his acknowledgement. He had already expressed his opinion in the emergency report, and no one had changed the plan because of it. He went back to his monitoring station and started watching. The second wave landed across 4 separate sites, one in South America, one in Central Asia, one in Southern Africa, and one in the Australian interior. The units dispersed immediately and began operations. For the first 3 days, their reports were efficient and on schedule. Defense systems were being compromised. Communication relays were being disrupted. A supply convoy moving between 2 major defense facilities was rerouted by false signals into a dead end and found its communications jammed for 18 hours. The Council received these reports and began to feel that the escalation had been the right call. On day 4, Dale Harmon read the same intelligence his teams had gathered about the second wave's landing sites, put the locations on a map, and looked at the pattern for about 2 minutes. Then he picked up the phone and made a series of calls that he had already prepared for, because he had expected a second wave and had spent the time since the first wave's arrival getting ready for it. He did not call in the conventional military. That was the instinct most people would have followed: more soldiers, more firepower, bigger response. Dale did not think that way. What had worked in the first 3 weeks had worked because it operated on the Blade's own terms, in their own kind of space, using the same principles they relied on but using them better. Adding conventional forces would change the nature of the engagement in ways that gave the Blades advantages they did not currently have: clear targets, predictable formations, traceable logistics. Instead, he activated the second tier of Pale Return. The first tier had been 12 people. The second tier was open to a wider pool, people who had not gone through the original selection process but who had been flagged in the program's database as meeting the core criteria. When the registration opened, quietly, through channels that did not advertise themselves, something happened that Dale had not fully predicted. Thousands of people showed up. Not all of them were qualified and not all of them were accepted, but the number who met the criteria, people with genuine wilderness survival backgrounds, tracking experience, the particular kind of mental discipline that Pale Return required, was larger than any projection had suggested. They came from farming communities, from search and rescue organizations, from hunting territories in a dozen different states and provinces and countries. They came from places that had never had any contact with formal military structures but had spent generations teaching their people how to move through land that did not forgive mistakes. Cole Briggs spent 3 days running assessments on the new arrivals at the Washington facility, moving through the groups with a quiet eye and a short list of questions. He was not looking for the fastest or the strongest. He was looking for the ones who went still when something surprised them instead of reacting. That stillness was the thing that could not be taught in 3 weeks. Either someone had it or they did not. He found 211 people who had it. Nina Ford organized them into small groups, mixed the experienced Pale Return members in with the new arrivals as anchors, and spent 4 days running them through terrain work that would have defeated most trained soldiers. The new arrivals did not complain. Most of them had grown up doing harder things for no particular purpose other than that the land around them required it. The second wave of Blades ran into something entirely different from what they had faced in the first 3 weeks. The disruption started small. A Blade unit moving through the South American highlands found its planned resupply cache empty and relocated, moved to a position that required the unit to cross 3 kilometers of open ground to reach it, which it was not willing to do. A unit in Central Asia found its planned observation point already occupied in a way it could not explain, and spent a night moving through terrain that seemed to know where it was going before it got there. The orbital support system that was supposed to give the ground units a live feed of the surrounding area started returning images that were accurate but not current. Someone had found a way to introduce a delay into the feed that was short enough to look like a system latency but long enough to be useless for real-time tracking. The unit commanders began filing requests for clarification that the Council did not know how to answer. Then the ambushes started. Not direct engagements, the Pale Return groups were under strict instruction not to engage the Blades in anything resembling a standard firefight. But the Blades' equipment began disappearing. Their communication relays were found physically altered in ways that should not have been possible without someone being inside the perimeter. Supply lines that had been mapped and checked were rerouted by people who had moved through the area so carefully that they left no useful trace. 3 Blade units requested emergency extraction because they had lost confidence in the security of their operational area, which in the 20-year history of the Blade program had happened exactly once before, on a world that had technology far more advanced than Earth's. The council in closed session stopped talking about timelines and started talking about what was happening. Grathvel filed another report. This one was longer than the first. He had spent the past weeks cross-referencing the Blade unit's movement data with the terrain analysis and the human deployment patterns his sensors could partially detect, and the picture he assembled was not comfortable. The humans were not responding to the second wave the way the council had assumed they would. They were not spreading thinner, not overextending, not showing the signs of an operation being stretched beyond its capacity. They were adapting and expanding in the same mode, as if they had planned for exactly this. He ended his report with a line that the council read several times without responding to. He wrote that in his professional assessment, the humans on the ground were not behaving like a civilization fighting to survive an assault. They were behaving like a civilization that had been waiting for a reason. The council chamber was very quiet after that was read aloud. Outside, the world still had no idea what was happening in its forests and mountains. People went about their days, argued about small things, lived their ordinary lives. The ones who knew, the ones in the Pale Return program and the ones in Dale's command circle, did not talk about it publicly. They did their work and came back and did it again the next day. Cole Briggs sat outside the Washington facility one evening and watched the sky for a while. He was not thinking about tactics or timelines. He was thinking about what it meant that a civilization up there had looked at Earth and decided to send their best killers in to soften it up. He thought they had probably made a mistake in how they read the word soft. He went back inside and went to sleep. There was more work in the morning. The communication request from the Vreth Collective came through on a quiet Thursday morning, routed through a channel that had never been used before and flagged at the highest level by 3 different monitoring systems before it reached Dale Harmon's desk. He read the request twice. It was formal, brief, and used the kind of careful language that told him the person who wrote it had been instructed to show no urgency. The collective wished to open direct dialogue with Earth's Defense Command at the earliest mutual convenience. They were proposing a structured exchange of positions, beginning with a mutual recognition of each party's situation on the ground. Dale showed the request to no one for an hour. He sat with it and thought about what it meant, and what the right answer was, and how he wanted to say it. Then he called his communications team and told them to set up the channel. The exchange opened at noon. On the collective side was a senior council representative, flanked by 2 advisors whose titles translated roughly to strategic assessment and conflict resolution. They were calm in presentation, composed, and spoke with the kind of measured authority that came from never having been in a conversation where they were not the more powerful party. Dale Harmon sat across the channel from them in a plain chair in a plain room with nothing on the table in front of him and no one beside him. He had chosen the setup deliberately. He looked like a man who had agreed to a meeting that he did not particularly need. The council representative opened by stating that the collective had authorized the current operation in response to intelligence suggesting Earth was developing certain capabilities that created a potential concern for regional stability. He said this without blinking, which Dale noted with a quiet internal appreciation for the skill involved. He said the collective was prepared to discuss a framework that addressed those concerns while respecting Earth's sovereign interests, and that this dialogue was an expression of the collective's good faith commitment to peaceful resolution. Dale let the statement finish. He did not respond to it directly. He said that he understood the collective had sent 2 deployment groups to Earth over the past several weeks. He said the first group of 12 had been effectively neutralized, with 1 member returned to collective space as a courtesy. He said the second group of 36 was currently in a condition he would describe as contained, not destroyed, but unable to operate effectively and unable to withdraw without assistance that only Earth's side could provide. He said all of this the same way he would have described a weather pattern, without any particular weight in his voice. The council representative's composure did not break. But one of the advisors made a small movement that was not quite a flinch, which told Dale that the assessment he had just given was more accurate than the collective had hoped he knew. Then Dale said the part he had spent the most time thinking about. He said that the people who had handled both deployment groups had not been Earth's military. They were volunteers. Civilians with wilderness backgrounds and the right kind of patience. Earth's actual military had not been involved in any of what had happened over the past weeks, because it had not needed to be. He let that sit for a moment, and then he said that if the collective was considering a third deployment, he would be unable to guarantee the same level of restraint from Earth's response, because the second tier of Pale Return had shown a level of enthusiasm for the work that made it difficult to set firm upper limits on what a third engagement might look like. He was not threatening. His voice was quiet and even throughout. He was describing a situation the way an honest person describes a situation when they want the other party to understand it clearly. The channel was silent for a longer moment than was comfortable. The council representative said that the collective had no intention of a third deployment. He said that the current situation clearly called for a different approach, and the collective was committed to that approach. He said the collective would initiate a full withdrawal of its ground assets within 48 hours, with the understanding that Earth would provide safe passage for the retrieval. Dale said that was acceptable. He also said that the withdrawal would need to be complete and verified, and that Earth would be monitoring the retrieval operation closely. He said this as a statement of fact, not a condition, because it was already true regardless of what the collective preferred. The representative agreed. The channel closed 20 minutes after it opened. Dale sat in the plane room for a while after the screen went dark. He was not celebrating. He was going through the next several steps in his head: the verification protocols for the withdrawal, the reporting structure for the council, the debriefing process for the Pale Return teams, and the considerably more complicated conversation he was going to have with 17 other galactic civilizations that had been monitoring the entire situation and had already sent quiet inquiries through back channels. That last item was going to take a lot of careful thought. He got up, stretched his back, and went to find his aide. The withdrawal happened as agreed. The collective's retrieval ships came in low and fast over the 4 landing sites, collected the ground assets, and were gone within 31 hours. The Pale Return teams watched from a distance and reported that the retrieval was clean and complete. No one on Earth's side made any move to interfere. The whole thing was very efficient. Grathvel, watching from his orbital station as the retrieval ships departed, filed a final report and then sat alone in his observation room for a long time. He had been doing this work for 19 years and had watched a lot of civilizations respond to collective pressure in a lot of different ways. He had seen fear, capitulation, desperate negotiation, and once, on a world in the outer territories, genuine military resistance that had lasted about 2 weeks before being overwhelmed by numbers. He had never seen anything that looked like what he had watched Earth do over the past several weeks. He turned the word over in his mind and found that the closest thing he could compare it to was confidence, not arrogance, not desperation, but the specific quiet confidence of something that had done this before in one form or another and knew roughly how it would go. He filed his report and requested transfer to a different assignment. Down on the surface, Cole Briggs and Nina Ford sat across from each other in a small debrief room in the Washington facility, each with a cup of coffee, going through the post-operation checklist with the same methodical attention they gave everything else. There were no medals. There was no ceremony. Pale Return did not work that way, and neither of them had expected any. The work was the work, and it was done, and that was enough. Nina had a bruise along her left side that had turned an impressive color, and Cole had a long scratch on his right hand from a tree branch that he had not noticed until it had already stopped bleeding. These were the only marks the operation had left on either of them, which they both considered a reasonable outcome. They finished the checklist, signed the forms, and handed them to the staff member waiting outside the door. Dale Harmon, across the building, was already on a call with the first of the 17 civilizations that had sent inquiries. This one was a mid-sized diplomatic power that had watched the entire situation with great interest and wanted to understand, in clear and practical terms, exactly what Earth was and what dealing with Earth would mean for their own calculations going forward. Dale told them, politely and honestly, that Earth was not looking for conflict with anyone. He said humanity had not enjoyed the past several weeks in any meaningful sense and was not interested in repeating them. He said Earth wanted normal, fair relations with the galactic community on terms that reflected mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. Then he said that if any civilization looked at the past several weeks and took from it the wrong lesson, specifically, the lesson that Earth's restraint was a sign of limitation rather than choice, then that civilization should feel free to come and find out the difference. He said it the same way Dale always said things, quietly, without drama, and with nothing behind it except the truth. The diplomat on the other end of the call was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood, and he thought his counsel would understand as well. The call ended. Dale looked at the list of 16 remaining inquiries on his desk and thought about getting another cup of coffee first. Outside, the world went on. People had breakfast, argued about small things, lived their ordinary lives. In the forests of 3 continents, the evidence of what had happened was already being quietly cleared away. In a few weeks, the only record of it would be in files that very few people would ever have clearance to read. The galaxy, watching from a careful distance, began the slow process of adjusting its understanding of what Earth was. It would take them a long time to finish that adjustment. They were going to need it.